Very much. I'm going to talk about the experience of ISDS in Australia and why there's so much community opposition to it, and also about the position of the current government, which has, we had an election in September and the government has changed and their position has changed somewhat. So I'll just briefly talk about some of the critical issues that have been debated about it, because that's been covered by the previous speakers, but then talk about why the previous Labor government in Australia developed a policy against ISDS, then the current government policy, then a bit about the history of community opposition and the fact that a previous Conservative government didn't include ISDS in the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. And then a recent case which has had a big influence in Australia, the Canadian gas mining regulation case, and its influence on one of the parties in the Conservative coalition, and finish up with talking about how the debate might go from here. So I won't go through this slide in detail, but just to say that ISDS is a flawed system. It allows a single foreign investor to sue a government over regulation which can be in the public interest, and even if it's unsuccessful, governments pay a very high price, and it's not really a legal system that has the safeguards that national legal systems have, because there's no independent judiciary, there's a lack of transparency, and it doesn't properly consider public interest issues. And as Melinda mentioned, the Australian government is not alone. The Labor government was not alone in rejecting this system. In fact, in October, 10 Latin American countries rejected it, and South Africa and India have also done so. So to move on to talk about the situation in Australia, under the previous Labor Party government, that party opposed ISDS because of community opposition. The new Liberal National Coalition government, which is now in office, has said it's prepared to negotiate ISDS on a case-by-case basis. Now, this is very worrying for us, particularly in relation to the TPP. And in fact, in a statement just a few days ago, the Trade Minister said that they were prepared to agree to ISDS in return for substantial concessions from the US on market access. So the current, in the negotiations up until now, they'll be still saying no to it, but they're prepared to negotiate it away. We don't think this is something that should be negotiable. The other thing that the Minister said was that they would be seeking exceptions for health and environment regulation. But we know from Melinda's presentation and from the experience of previous US free trade agreements that those exceptions have not been effective in previous trade agreements. And in fact, the US is not even agreeing to have them in the TPP. Now, the history of public opposition to ISDS in Australia goes back to the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement, the OSFTA, a weird name, in 2004, where the critical debate was actually based on the experience of the North American Free Trade Agreement cases. There was a lot of public debate and concern, especially from environment and health groups, because of the kind of examples that Melinda outlined, and there was a lot of lobbying of government and opposition parties. And in the end, that Conservative government, the Liberal National Coalition government led by John Howard, did not include ISDS in the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. Now, after that, in 2010, the Australian Productivity Commission actually did a review which included, of Australia's trade agreements, which included looking at ISDS. Now, just to explain, this commission is actually quite a conservative body. It's a statutory body which provides economic advice to government. It's consistently supported free trade, and it's been supportive of multilateral non-discriminatory trade agreements. But it did a report in 2010 which reviewed the evidence on ISDS and found that ISDS gives additional rights to foreign investors over local investors. It found that there was no recent evidence of market failure or economic problems that would justify ISDS, no systematic bias against foreign investors, and also that there was no evidence of increased foreign investment if countries have ISDS. This is often one of the arguments that's used, that investors will have more confidence and there will be more investment if you have ISDS provisions in trade agreements. But if you actually look at the evidence, this is not supported. And they found that the experience of ISDS demonstrates considerable policy and financial risk to governments from ISDS. So that influenced the previous Australian Labor Party government trade policy, both the Public Opposition and the Productivity Commission report, and it came out with a policy which said it wouldn't support ISDS because it gave greater legal rights to foreign businesses than those available to domestic businesses, and it wouldn't support measures which constrained its ability to regulate in health and environmental areas. And in particular, it mentioned tobacco advertising because by that stage, Philip Morris Tobacco Company had already launched a case against the Uruguayan government for regulation of tobacco advertising. And the government not only didn't support it for Australia, but also said it wouldn't demand it of other countries. And of course, this was then reinforced by the experience of the Philip Morris Tobacco Company actually launching an ISDS case against the government's own plain packaging legislation. So I'll just say a bit about that. This was the policy of the previous Labor government. It implements the Framework Convention on Tobacco from the World Health Organization Convention. It aims to reduce the number of younger smokers based on research showing that when kids start smoking, they don't just start smoking cigarettes, they start smoking particular brand names because the brand is associated with certain glamorous or other attractive ideas, you know, the Marlboro Man or the whatever. It was passed in 2011 and implemented in 2012. So Philip Morris took a range of actions, and other tobacco companies took a range of actions against the legislation. It's actually a US company. It lobbied actively for ISDS in the TPPA. They made a submission saying we want to have ISDS in the TPPA because it will enable us to take action against tobacco regulation. In the case of Australia, it couldn't use the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement to take action because there was no provision for ISDS. And so they used an Asian arm of their company to acquire Philip Morris Australia, and that meant that they became a Hong Kong investor in Australia. They shopped around until they found a forum where they could launch such a case. And so they actually launched the case before the legislation was passed, hoping to frighten the government into withdrawing the legislation. But the legislation was passed in any case, and it was actually passed with bipartisan support. The opposition parties supported it, and there were polls done which showed that the majority of people, over 60% of people, supported the legislation, and that's because a lot of people have relatives who've died from tobacco-related diseases. Now, there was a series of other legal actions. There was a concerted strategy by the tobacco companies. They launched a constitutional challenge in the Australian High Court, a group of tobacco companies led by British American Tobacco and Japan Tobacco. And what they were alleging here was that because they could no longer show their trademarks, that this was an acquisition of their property which was not on just terms, and that relates to a section of the Australian Constitution. At the same time, Ukraine, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, and now they've been joined by some other countries, lodged a WTO dispute. Now, in the WTO, there are only government-to-government disputes. We know the tobacco companies are supporting those governments in lodging that dispute. Philip Morris has actually referred to it as part of its strategy. I won't talk further about the WTO case that's ongoing, but I'm going to concentrate now on the High Court case and Philip Morris's use of ISDS. So the Australian High Court made a decision in 2012. It found that the legislation didn't violate our Constitution, and the reasons found that it was justified public health legislation, regulation, and that there was no acquisition of property that had occurred, and it awarded costs against the tobacco companies, and that was a 6-to-1 majority decision. So it was the decision of the highest court in Australia that found that tobacco companies had no case to be compensated for this legislation. But Philip Morris on the same day made an announcement saying, we don't think the High Court case has any relevance to our ISDS case. We are going to continue to sue the Australian government through the Hong Kong Australia investment agreement, and that case is still ongoing. And that provoked even stronger community opposition in Australia. There was outraged editorials and a lot of letters to the press and so on. And in fact, even an arbitration lawyer who was very much in favour of ISDS said he thought that this case could give ISDS a bad name. There's been another case which has fuelled further community opposition in Australia, and that's a case in Canada which is about the regulation of shale gas mining. Now, in Australia, we've had coal seam gas mining, and there's been a number of rural communities who wanted to have regulation of this type of mining in terms of how it relates to its distance from where people live, its effect on water tables, its effect on agricultural land. And they have succeeded in getting at least 2 state governments to conduct environmental reviews, and in one case to actually introduce new regulation of this kind of mining. Now, those communities who are mostly Conservative coalition government supporters were very alarmed to find that the US Lone Pine Company is using the ISDS provisions in the North American Free Trade Agreement to sue the Quebec state or provincial government in Canada for exactly the same kind of environmental review of gas mining. And they are very fearful that if Australia signs up to ISDS, particularly in the TPP, that US companies and companies from some of the other TPP nations could, who are investing in coal seam gas in Australia, could sue if there were further regulation in Australia. So there's actually developed quite strong opposition in those communities to ISDS, and many of them, as I said, are supporters of the National Party, which is one of the partners in the current coalition government. It's the smaller partner, but it is significant. So the implications for the TPPA are that there's strong continuing community opposition to ISDS across the political spectrum, from a section of the government's own supporters and also from a range of other community groups because of the kind of cases we've talked about. Public health organisations, anti-tobacco organisations, unions, churches, all kinds of community organisations are concerned about this. And the community opposition, we think, will continue to influence what the Australian government does. And if it agrees to have or to trade off ISDS in the TPP, it will pay a very high political price. So we still think that we're trying to influence our government not to do so, but if it does so, there will be continuing opposition and stronger opposition to the TPP itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. We are now open to question and answers from the press. If you have any questions regarding the investment issues, one of the chapters in the TPP, please state your name and organization.
A little bit. Is there any radiation monitoring going on in Japan for people, for their food supply? I mean, do people, I mean, if Japan depends on fish. Fish live in the ocean. The ocean is being filled with radioactive material. Do the Japanese, are they getting irradiated? Do they know that they're getting to level to which, or is this just a giant uncontrolled experiment and 40 years back and going, oh, look at that spike in birth defects?
There is food monitoring going on. Whether it's adequate or not is another question. But, you know, compare the United States to Japan. Japan's legal limit for radioactivity in food is 100 becquerels per kilogram. That's radioactive cesium content, but it's used as a proxy for other radioactive poisons.
Right.
In the United States, our standard is 12 times weaker. We allow 1,200 becquerels per kilogram of radioactivity in our food. And what that means is unfit for human consumption because of its radioactive contamination in Japan could be legally exported to the United States and sold on the open market. So they are, unfortunately, way ahead of us here in terms of radiation monitoring of their food supply. Ours is pre-Fukushima at this point in terms of the seafood supply.
We were in a restaurant the other day with a friend who eats fish, and he just said to the, you know, it's not a problem for me. I'm vegan. I avoid this stuff. But, you know, he said to the waiter, where did this fish come from? And the waiter said, just a minute, I'll find out. And he came back and he said, it came from China, as far as we can tell. It was imported from Asia. I'm wondering if that came from Japan. Is Japan now a source of discount food because they can sell stuff here that they can't legally sell there? And are we being told if that's the case?
It's legal for them to do that, unfortunately, and it's a huge dereliction of duty by the U.S. federal government. Our federal agency should be monitoring the food. Our food safety standards should be much stronger. So we need to change that. We need to change it in Congress. We need to change it in the executive branch through public pressure.
Wow. So 1,200 becquerels in a kilogram of food coming from Asia. That's 1,200 radioactive disintegrations per hour, per minute?
Per second.
Per second.
Per second, ongoing.
So that's 1,200 opportunities to cause cancer every second that this food would be releasing for, depending on which radioactive isotope it is, months, years, decades, centuries.
That's right.
Astounding.
Good day. This is Dr. Conrad Miller, MD, and I'm here today to talk to you about the worst thing happening on the planet right now, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, abbreviated TPP, which involves 800 million people, 40% of the economic activity on the earth, and is the largest free trade deal ever produced in the history of the earth. But you haven't heard about it because it's not on your radio, it's not on your TV, unfortunately. They've had 24 meetings in secret over the last several years, mostly corporations and trade representatives of 12 countries around the Pacific Rim, including the United States, Canada, Peru, Vietnam, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and the door is being left open for China, South Korea, Russia, India, and any other countries that will step in. Okay, the big thing is that corporations, as if they were states, can challenge countries, any law in these countries, for example, federal, state, or local laws in the United States, in secret courts or tribunals where three men, usually it's men that are the judges, they're all trade lawyers, usually decide in favor of the corporation 90% of the time or more, as in NAFTA or the World Trade Organization, previous free trade agreements, that whatever law is challenged is an illegal barrier to free trade and it has to be changed or eliminated, or the country has to pay expected future profits that could have been made because the law was enacted. Of course, nobody wants to pay those. So in these courts, the corporations are empowered to sue for environmental laws, health laws, consumer laws, zoning laws, or any other public policies that the corporations claim are either undermining their rights or diminishing their expected future profits. And when these rulings are made in secret, no affected parties can attend the tribunals, including small business owners or workers, local residents, or potentially poisoned people. Just the lawyers for the corporations and those of the challenged country are allowed to attend these tribunals behind closed doors. And the judges one day may be lobbyists for the corporations, and the next day they may be judges. Just 3 of them. And this is called the investor-state dispute settlement. The most horrific thing about these courts or tribunals is that once a decision is made, there can be no appeal to a real court, because the TPP tribunals will be the highest court, above our Supreme Court, if we sign on to this trade agreement. Sign the TPP, we sign away our country's sovereignty and democratic rights as trade agreements supersede national laws. For what we would be doing to ourselves is putting the hammer down for the corporations and banks to tighten their grip on the new world order we keep grimly hearing about. So all of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they've met in secret. They've developed 29 chapters, and only 5 deal with tariff and trade, and the rest protect the corporations, or as Jim Hightower says, the other 24 chapters consist of various ways to free rapacious corporations from any accountability for the havoc they wreak and from any responsibility to the world community's common good. So that's what can happen in the trade courts. Now, specifically, there are things that are written up about food safety. For example, in the United States, we have the highest food standards, and we have to harmonize ours down to international standards. Things that also can be challenged are the labeling of genetically modified food. 90% of Americans want their GMOs labeled, their soy, their canola, their cottonseed oil. And some states have passed laws that will make it necessary to label genetically modified organisms in crops and food. But these laws can be challenged in these little trade courts or tribunals. Mexico, for example, in 2000, the Senate unanimously backed GMO food labeling, and within 3 months the United States threatened to impose sanctions via NAFTA, that was the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the decision was reversed. Then there's also country of origin labeling for meat, and 90% of Americans also favor that, and that can be challenged. Then there's the internet. You can go to the internet, we can look up things very quickly, we can see how a jellyfish swims, how the weather is in Austin, Texas in a few seconds. There was a battle over this and net neutrality that we did win in the United States, where the corporations like AT&T and Comcast wanted to make a slow lane for average users and a fast lane for corporate users. But with the TPP, it's already been set up for corporate created content, giving copyright protection for that for 120 years. And the deal will also transform internet service providers into a private Big Brother police force empowered to monitor our user activity, arbitrarily take down our content, and cut off our access to the internet. Now, we also have Buy America, Buy Austin, Buy Our Own Country, and we have these deals for government procurement where, for example, the government buys cars or only buys things that aren't made by child labor. And the U.S. procurement market is $1.7 trillion, very big market. Everybody wants to get into it. All the TPP countries want to get into it. And the TPP locks in and expands privatization and deregulation of public services. And now, public services that weren't accessible to corporations will be under the TPP, including transportation, water treatment, corrections, education, healthcare. Then there's fracking, where the Department of Energy will lose control over how much fracking is done, and the environmental impact will not be studied. It's important because Japan, one of the main countries in the TPP, is the world's largest natural gas importer, so we would expect more fracking to be done in the United States and lose control of how much is done and what environmental damages result. Then we'll lose a lot of jobs. We've already lost about 6 million jobs because of the various trade agreements that exist. And the U.S. corporations would get special foreign investor protection to limit the cost and risk of relocating their factories to low-wage nations that sign on to this agreement. But Vietnam, for example, the United States Department of Labor has cited Vietnam as one of only 3 countries in the world to engage in forced child labor in its apparel industry. Plus, surveys cited unsafe working conditions in its apparel industry. This is important because Vietnam is the second largest exporter of apparel to the United States, behind only China. Instead of suspending trade talks with Vietnam until it meets basic international standards for human and workers' rights, we're rewarding them with duty-free access. The TPP would block federal, state, and local governments from taking action to boost job creation, which is kind of outrageous. And then we have the banks. The banks are one of the big authors of most of these other 24 chapters in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and they basically don't want any of the rules that normally would protect the government, the people, from the banks, like transaction taxes, or also called Robin Hood taxes, which are already approved in 11 European countries. That's imposing a tiny tax on Wall Street transactions to tamp down speculation-fueled volatility, while generating hundreds of billions of dollars worth of revenue for social, health, or environmental causes. Then there are firewall reforms that have been blocked by the banks writing them into the TPP. TPP could ban capital controls, which even the International Monetary Fund is in favor of. Basically, extreme deregulation is the problem, and we know that hasn't worked in the United States, and now the TPP is taking that up. So basically, the TPP creates permanent corporate rule over us and all the other countries in the TPP. If we want to make a change in the TPP, we have to get all 12 countries to agree to that change. Otherwise, nothing can be changed. In 2010, all the nations involved signed a formal pledge to keep the details of their deliberations from the public and to keep documents related to the deal undercover until 4 years after the process is completed. And Ron Kirk, who was Barack Obama's top trade representative, said that locking out the people is necessary because the deal's details would outrage Americans and spook Congress from rubber stamping it. So even though Congress has to regulate commerce with foreign nations, the game is President Obama and the Republicans especially want to, instead of open the whole TPP to Congress and review everything, they want to fast track it, which means everybody can only vote yes or no on the whole deal, one way or the other, and that's the end of it. So the ultimate answer is, we've stopped things like this before. We have to say no to fast track, which may come up in the Congress in March. It may take 60 days to pass. If not, we can block the Trans-Pacific Partnership and fast track. You can call 202-224-3121 and call your congressman, and we'll leave some other numbers and contacts for you. This is Dr. Conrad Miller. Thank you very much. No to fast track, no to the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
For the last few years, I've had this sense that everything I learned as a kid about how America's government works is completely wrong. But I had no idea how bad things actually were until I saw this one graph. Researchers at Princeton University looked at more than 20 years worth of data to answer a pretty simple question. Does the government represent the people? Now, this is what they found. This axis here represents public support for any given idea. On the left, at 0%, are ideas that not a single American wants. On the right, at 100%, are ideas that everyone supports. This axis represents the likelihood of Congress passing a law that reflects any of these ideas, from a 0 to a 100% chance. On this graph, an ideal republic would look like this. If 50% of the public supports an idea, there's a 50% chance of it becoming law. If 80% of us support something, there's an 80% chance. You get the idea. Now, most Americans would probably agree that, with a few exceptions, we should be as close to this ideal as possible. Unfortunately, the way America actually works doesn't even come close. Take an idea that nobody supports, literally nobody, and it has about a 30% chance of becoming federal law. Now, take an incredibly popular idea, the most popular idea this country has ever seen, and there's also about a 30% chance of it becoming law. This means that the number of American voters for or against any idea has no impact on the likelihood that Congress will make it law. Put another way, and I'm just going to quote the Princeton study directly here, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. So if you've ever felt like your opinion doesn't matter and that the government doesn't really care what you think, well, you're right. But there's a catch. This flat line only accounts for the bottom 90% of income earners in America. Economic elites, business interests, people who can afford lobbyists, they get their own line. Look at how much closer their line is to the ideal. When they want something, the government is much more likely to do it. And when they don't, they have the power to completely block it from happening, no matter how much the rest of the country supports it. They get what they want, and guess who ends up paying for it? We pay for it with the most expensive healthcare in the world. We pay for it with a tax code that's a complete mess. We pay for it with internet that's slower and more expensive, with wasteful spending, a floundering education system, a catastrophic drug war, and 1 in 5 American children born into poverty. Almost every major issue we face as a nation can be traced back to this graph. How does this happen? Well, just follow the money. Right now, it's perfectly legal to buy political influence in America. Here's how it works. Let's say a big bank wants a law that would force taxpayers to bail them out again if they repeat the exact same reckless behavior that crashed the global economy in 2008. Not exactly the most popular idea with the public, and Congress knows that. That should be the end of it. But that's where the money comes in. It's perfectly legal for our bank to hire a team of lobbyists whose entire job is to make sure that the government gives the bank what it wants. Then those lobbyists can track down members of Congress who regulate banks and help raise a ton of money for their re-election campaigns. It's perfectly legal for those lobbyists to offer those same politicians million-dollar jobs at their lobbying firm. Then, those lobbyists can literally write the language of this new bailout law themselves and hand it off to the politician they just buttered up with campaign money and lucrative job offers. And it's perfectly legal for those politicians to take the lobbyist-written language and sneak it through Congress at the last second. So now you've got a law that greatly benefits the banks, and the whole process can start over. This is how a bill becomes a law. A special interest hires some lobbyists, those lobbyists collect campaign contributions, offer jobs, and then write the laws that Congress then passes to help those same special interests. This happens every day on every single issue with politicians of both parties. In the last 5 years alone, the 200 most politically active companies in the United States spent $5.8 billion influencing your government. Those same companies got $4.4 trillion in taxpayer support. And that's trillion, with a T. And that's just the top 200 companies. Never mind every other special interest, every union, every trade association, and every billionaire. Every single one of them can use their money to buy political influence. You know, there's this idea out there that this only became a problem after the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010. But the data goes back almost 40 years, and the results are clear. Corruption is legal in America. And as long as it is, anyone who can spend money to buy political influence will. The solution here isn't rocket science. Make corruption illegal. We already know Congress won't do it. I mean, one look at this chart will tell you that. What we need is a plan that lets us go around Congress and do what the American people do best. Fix this mess ourselves. Well, good news. We have that plan and it's already working. Now that we've got the problem covered, let us show you how to be part of the solution.
The only idea that we do not agree with is the notion that we should take investment arbitration out of TTIP altogether. First of all, of course, the United States is a functioning democracy based on the rule of law. But that does not mean that there is no risk to investors. US courts are not obliged to follow commitments that the US take internationally. And the US does not always respect the international commitments. The US has the most WTO cases against it than any other WTO member. What you have in front of you is not a legal text, and that's on purpose because we wanted to have your input before we move to the next step of the process internally in the Commission and sets out a legal proposal.
Madame la Commissaire, merci d'être là. Je ne vous cache pas mon extraordinaire déception à la lecture de votre papier. Je suis désolé, Madame, mais dans votre proposition, vous ne faites toujours pas la démonstration de savoir pourquoi il faut ISDS entre l'Europe et le Canada, ISDS entre l'Europe et les États-Unis. Il n'y a toujours pas cette démonstration. La Banque mondiale, l'OCDE disent pas besoin d'ISDS pour augmenter les flux d'investissement. Vous avez même, votre direction a sorti un rapport sur l'accord avec la Corée du Sud. Vous dites, formidable, il y a plus d'investissements, mais il n'y a pas d'ISDS dans l'accord avec la Corée du Sud. Donc, au fond, vous n'arrivez toujours pas à démontrer la nécessité de ce dispositif. Vous pouvez dire ce que vous voulez, un avocat d'affaires, ça n'est pas un juge. Un avocat d'affaires, ça n'est pas un juge. Ce n'est pas en privatisant une partie de la justice et de nos choix de société tels qu'ils vont être comparés, mis en confrontation avec le droit des affaires, ce n'est pas en faisant ça qu'on redonne de la valeur, du poids au processus démocratique. S'il doit y avoir une cour permanente, ce n'est pas dans le long terme, une fois qu'on aura mis un ISDS qui donnera tout le pouvoir aux firmes multinationales, gardons les systèmes juridiques nationaux, travaillons à une cour permanente comme première étape d'un tribunal international, et là on aura fait de la démocratie, on aura servi les intérêts de l'Europe. Merci.
If you're saying that the long-term view is to create this international courts, does that mean that there will be a sunset clause for ISDS in TTIP, CETA and Singapore, or how are we going to phase out those then existing ISDS clauses if there's a new court? Another question is, which is not entirely ISDS, but sustainable impact assessment. We hear somehow on the corridors that one has been made, but it's not public yet. When are you going to publish the sustainable impact assessment on TTIP? And furthermore, I would just like to stress that the proposals that you have made do not at all address the core problem of ISDS as I see it, namely that ISDS creates an extra judicial system for investors, and it's only about the rights of investors. No person can redress to an investor when their human rights are being violated, and that happens a lot, be it in Latin America and be it elsewhere in the world. So how are we going to address those? I think ISDS is just creating an extrajudicial system for investors, for certain investors only, and it should not have any space in our legal system in the European Union.
On Canada and on ISDS, as I said, we have made important, and you have all, many of you been involved in that, changes that are now reflected in the ISDS in Canada and Singapore. Both these agreements are closed. We are not going to open the agreements. On the Sustainable Development was Mrs. Keller as well who asked that. It is working. We are consulting a lot with it, so it's not ready yet. And I cannot give you an exact date. It will be later in the fall. It's not ready yet. Yes. So let me come back when we are moving. But it's a lot of data and a lot of consultants that we are doing on this. Well, the issue of a sunset clause or something, as Mrs. Keller raised, that's a good question. I don't have the answer to that, but I'll take it with me.